when we're talking about plant and aquarium lighting, it's such a massive topic, and it goes beyond the scope of a short video. So I'll just deal with the basics. When I started planted tanks, I used fluorescent T8 lighting, which was relatively basic. I fitted reflectors to get it more efficient. They say it's supposed to double the efficiency, don't they?
Yeah, they say that, yeah.
I don't think it does. And not all reflectors are made the same either. You can get gold wing reflectors, which reduce restrike. So you can get the light constantly bouncing back and forwards and it's lost.
Right, yeah.
But the gold wing kind of
interesting.
prevents that. I had a dual Rio 125, a dual Rio 125, and I had two T8s without reflectors, and it wasn't really good enough to grow most plants. So I retrofitted more T8s, and I actually managed to get 4 in there, and that's when I started really and CO2 injection, and that's when I could really grow the plants. And then things moved on from fluorescent quite quickly onto T8 onto T5.
T5, yeah,
which is
T5s,
quite popular now still. Again, with reflectors, makes it more efficient. And then now we're on LED, which is a whole new topic. But I guess the biggest question, I don't know about you, Dave, you get asked a lot of questions from your customers, is how do I know if I have enough light? So what would you...
It's a good question, and it's probably one of the number one questions. How do you know if you've got enough light? You need to look at, first of all, what plants you're growing, is what I always suggest. So you need to look at what plants you're growing and sort of choose your light accordingly.
Yeah.
Or if you do it the other way around, if you've already got your light, then choose your plants accordingly.
Yeah, so you've got a kit tank all in one system.
Yeah, then you are, if you've got say one bulb, one T5 bulb for example, then you are limited to what you can grow.
Yeah. So what would you say would be the minimum, if I wanted to grow, let's say, a carpet of, I don't know, Hemianthus cuba, what would you...
I would say the minimum in an average sort of 30 centimetre depth or 35 centimetre depth tank would be 2 T5 bulbs with reflectors.
Yeah.
I'd say as a minimum. It's classed as regarded as medium to high lighting, I think.
And I think if we go back in history, do you remember the old watts per gallon rule?
Yeah.
I think we can completely forget about that because there's loads of flaws to that. and I think you can also, in my experience, you can almost forget about lighting levels in general if you focus on the other aspects to plant growing. So CO2 injection is massive. If you have good CO2 levels and circulation, I think you can grow quite demanding plants without much light. Personally, I've experienced that. So I think the number one tip is don't get too obsessed with have I got enough light. Is that light going to be used effectively in combination with everything else in the tank?
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that's fair point.
And I think a big beginner mistake is to assume more light is better and then not balance that with appropriate levels of CO2 if they're using it, circulation, water changes, and other maintenance practices. And things like, I mean, today we had a customer who had their lights on for 12 hours a day.
Yeah.
She was doing everything else right. They had the CO2 on 2 hours before the lights. They were dosing a comprehensive liquid fertiliser regularly.
Yeah.
And then we found out right at the end that she had her lights on for 12 hours a day.
Yeah,
so,
any more than 8 hours of lighting, you sort of are risking. Algae with algae, playing with algae. Really.
I go for the set 8 hours.
Yeah.
And so let's go back to measuring light. We've got PAR meters now, and so PAR measures in micromoles per meters squared per second. I think that's the unit.
You know more than me.
But you're generally given a number, and that's the unit, micromoles per meter squared per second.
Yeah.
I believe. And it ranges from anything from 0, which is no light, all the way up to really, really high light, which is 200 sort of plus. Reef tanks even higher. Wow. And if you're lucky enough to have a PAR meter, then you can measure that, and it's ideally going to be a waterproof PAR meter, and you can put it at the substrate level, you switch it on, and it will give you a digital readout of this number, and you can tell how much photosynthetic active radiation, which is PAR, is hitting the substrate.
Yeah.
And so anything above the substrate level is going to be obviously a higher reading, and you can take readings all over the tank. And I typically go to the right in the corners at the bottom, and that's where typically where the least light is going to hit. So if you're hitting enough light there, you can guarantee to be hitting enough light everywhere else. Yeah. And I managed to grow things like, I mean, cryptocorini I've grown down to 5 micromoles.
Wow.
But things like a demanding sort of carpeting species, you're talking probably a minimum of 40 or 50 micromoles at the substrate. Yeah. That's a little bit more advanced parameters. You can kind of do it on the cheap with a Senai reef that has a built-in parameter. Yeah. Or you can borrow one from a rich guy. I've borrowed one from a couple of places I've worked for before, and it is an interesting thing. We've never done any power readings in here, have we?
You have actually.
Did
you came in with a power meter once. I think it was probably last year sometime, and you actually did this tank with this light, I think.
And what was it?
It was about 50 in the corners.
Yeah.
So 50 in the corners are probably slightly higher in the middle.
Yeah. Let's go back to basics.
Yeah.
Lighting is the most important thing for plants to photosynthesize.
Yeah.
So plants convert light and CO2 basically.
Yeah.
And they create it creates plant growth, and the more light you have, the more the plant wants to grow. It's the primary driving factor for plant growth, and so you need to bear that in mind. That's quite important with regard to CO2 and other nutrient levels and circulation as well, because what happens is as you're bombarding that plant with photons, which is the unit of kind of what light is, that plant is wanting to photosynthesize really hard the more light you throw at it. But if it doesn't have enough food to grow, to feed that demand because of all that light, then it will start to suffer. And then I think the number one trigger, I don't know if you agree with this, the number one trigger for algae is probably a suffering plant.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And you'll notice
algae for me is a bit like a predator, so if
yeah.
it is seeing a suffering plant, it will
Yeah.
It will be growing on that suffering plant rather than the healthy plant that might even be sitting next to it.
And I don't know what the chemistry and the biology is. Hopefully, someone's watching that might know that can chip in. But you need to balance. I think the plants actually produce maybe an allelochemical.
I read that the other day. Yeah.
Which helps to keep algae away, and so what we'll say is the more light you have, the more CO2 you'll need, the more other nutrients you need, macro and micronutrients, and especially in a very high light tank, you need to be dosing fertilisers every day, probably having a really good spot on CO2 regime, so high enough level, and getting that CO2 around the tank effectively. Yeah. And so that's kind of for more advanced aquascapers and planted tank keepers, I would say, for high lights. Anything more than the equivalent of two T5s with reflectors at a sort of standard size aquarium I would say was high light. And if we want to convert that into LED terms, it's quite tricky because not all LEDs are the same. Most LEDs can be suspended, so you can suspend them from in say the T5, you can suspend them from any height you like above the tank, so that has an impact on how much light's hitting the plants, obviously. But I would say on average, and this is based on my own personal experience, an LED is roughly twice as efficient per watt than T5 reflector.
Speaking,
I would say roughly. So these are excellent actually, aren't they? These Twin Star
33 watts. These are
33 watts. So you're looking at so a T5 for this would be 24 watts. Yeah. So you're looking at about 2 or 3,
2.5 to 3 bulbs. Yeah.
Yeah. So you definitely need, I would say, CO2 injection in the tank with this lighting. And certainly if you're using multiple of these, you're going to be that's crazy.
I probably wouldn't ever use more than one, really.
No, I mean we're getting really good red plant growth. I don't know if guys can see behind Dave there. The Alternanthera's going really red. We've got the Hygrophilus going red here, which is an indicator of good lighting. And that's a whole other topic actually, is inducing pigmentation in red plants, which you can maybe chat about in a minute. So T5 is, they're probably what you guys as old school, even T8, there's still T8 available.
Yeah.
You sell T8 here?
No.
Just
I've
T5.
got some T5 bulbs, yeah. But
Did you sell many?
More and more people are converting over to LED, so T5 I'm not selling so
Yeah,
many, but
okay.
it's all about LED.
So it's all LED now.
Yeah.
So let's have a little chat about LED in more detail. So I would say the main advantages of LED are its controllability.
Yeah, with most LED lights that can come with a controller.
I
so
mean,
you can dim it.
these are an exception. These are just on or off.
Yeah.
But the price reflects that. They're not expensive.
Yeah.
More efficient, like we said. So we're not producing as much. We're not using as much energy.
They last a lot longer.
Yeah.
So you'd have to replace them with T5s. You may be replacing the bulbs every year or so.
Yeah, and I've heard mixed stories about T5 replacing.
Whether you need to do that's another argument, I suppose. But people do replace them.
Yeah. Potentially more waterproof. Some units have a really good IP rating, which means they have an index of protection. So if they drop in the water, they can be much safer than other types of light. And maybe less heat emission as well. The more powerful LEDs will have a fan. They have either passive cooling, which means it just relies on a heat sink, which is what these are. So there's no fan. Active cooling, it has a built-in fan, and the more advanced units will have a fan that comes on and off at different rates depending on how hard they're working. Yeah. So we have a Radian Ecotech behind us, which is
got a built-in fan. You can,
and that comes on and off depending on how hard we're working it. So. So LEDs very popular. They have more of a point source, so rather than a uniform light spreading across the whole aquarium, the light is concentrated from one point generally, and that creates shadowing, shimmer effects, glitter lines, whatever you want to call it. And for a lot of people, that's an attractive thing. It looks more natural, more like the sun.
Yeah.
And so that's a potential advantage.
So another advantage as well is an actual T5 light or T8 light is quite bulky, so the unit that it comes on is usually quite a big, ugly unit that sits on top of the aquarium. With the LEDs, they're only very small, so the unit's usually very slender, very minimalist. So I think that looks-wise, LEDs usually look a lot better in the home.
Yeah. And the more advanced units have adjustable spectrums as well, so you can adjust it to suit your personal taste, and arguably change it to suit different growth patterns in a plant. So I know with terrestrial plants, a lot of growers of different vegetables, etc., will deliberately change the spectrum at different development stages of a plant to induce different things. So Kessel have just released the H80 light. Have you heard of this?
The horticulture one,
yeah. And if you look at the spectral graph, it's just it's controllable, but there's no green. Basically, it's all red or all blue, and you can adjust it to induce different or to help different stages of development. So there's blooming, flowering, growth, all those. Depending on the red and the blue balance will depend on how it's going to grow that plant. Now, whether or not that applies to aquatic plants so much, I'm actually not know. I don't know, but we have experienced ourselves, Dave, haven't we?
Well,
different lights have done different things to different plants. So let's talk about the Legendra in there.
Yeah, Legendra Meboldi Red, which is looks very similar to some cryptocorin. It's a lovely plant, but we have actually managed to keep it growing relatively short under the particular LED that it's growing under now, which is the Radion LED, freshwater LED. Whereas I know George has grown this plant before, and it's grown very tall. It's a very long stem, so
but it's under low light.
But it's under low light, so arguably the strength of the light, the intensity of the light, is actually
giving it more of a compact growth.
Yeah.
And that anecdotal evidence suggests the more light you have, the more compact the growth.
Yeah.
It might be a fact, it might be a scientific fact, but we've experienced it ourselves. The Hygrophila polysperma is really compact on there, isn't it? Yeah.
The rotala behind you, extremely compact.
Yeah, I mean this is I don't know if you can see, guys, behind me.
It's actually wanting to grow downwards.
It's almost like carpeting, isn't it?
Yeah. Can you see it on there?
Yeah.
Just a bit.
Yeah, so if I just point to it here. So you can see there's a little bit here. It's actually growing downwards. Which I guess and you can see how compact. I don't know if you can see, guys, the Hydrocotyl tripartia there, super compact. So yeah, and interestingly, the lights are made of different colour LEDs rather than just being a white LED.
Yeah.
They've got the blue, red, green, and white in there. So
yeah, I mean,
We're really happy with them, aren't we? These twin stars.
Yeah, if you're using CO2 and if you've got a high energy setup,
Yeah.
they're ideal.
I like Kessel. I use Kessel at home. More expensive, but very controllable. You can control the spectrum and the intensity with a controller. You can ramp it up, ramp it down, all automatically. It's interesting. I used to buy cheap office tubes. You know, like what we've got, like in the, and they grow plants. So I think you know, a lot of emphasis is placed on, you know, this plant's best for plant, this tube's best for plant growth, or this light's best for plant growth. But actually, I would argue that pretty much any light that's visible to us, any part of that spectrum, I can't remember the numbers now, it's something like 420 to 640 nanometers wavelength, which is just visible to humans, is capable of growing a plant. So
just in different ways depending on what.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
And so if anyone asks me what light should I get, I'll go for what suits your taste and what suits your budget.
Yeah.